In the southwest corner of Colorado lies the poster-perfect town of Ouray, and like many towns in the mountains of Colorado, has its origins in the state's mining boom of the late 1800s. But following the collapse of the silver industry in the early 1890s, Ouray, unlike many towns and mines, managed to weather, buoyed mainly by the discovery of gold nearby. However, gold mining too declined, and today, like virtually all surviving mining towns in the state, found its ultimate salvation in tourism. Today, Ouray is known primarily for its hot springs and climbing culture, especially with regards to ice climbing and its annual construction of its extremely photogenic ice park. But Ouray never stopped being a mining town, not entirely. A few mines have operated on and off in the area ever since the town's founding, including the mine involved in this incident. The Revenue Virginius mine, which can better be described as an interconnected complex of several mines, has its origins in 1876 and, similar to Ouray, managed to weather the collapse of the silver industry in 1893. Owned by Albert Reynolds and his descendants for the majority of its history, the mine has been operated off and on by multiple interests since the beginning, before finally changing ownership in 2012 to Star Mines, which would be the incident company as Star Mine Operations LLC a year later.
Dry, dusty, heartbeat beside me, dead streets carving.
Mining has always been a hazardous occupation, and historically, also extremely dangerous. With a mine as old as the Revenue, there have likely been dozens of fatalities there over the decades. Some of these deaths may have had a form filled out by a shifter on the day of an incident, getting passed on to his superior, who then perhaps discarded the report, or perhaps not, regardless now lost to time, or at best, buried in a warehouse. Others may have had a brief mention in a long dead paper, scant on details but heavy with condolences to the family, and still others may have resulted in no paper trail whatsoever, with only an oral history passed down by his coworkers and family as a lesson to others. Tragically, we can't learn anything in the acute sense from these unfortunate souls, but mining is safer now than ever, and only becomes safer by the day. And every death in the industry has contributed in sometimes small, sometimes large, but always meaningful ways to the living corpus of knowledge contributing to the increased safety the miners enjoy today. And because of these advances in safety and culture, every death, at least here in the United States, is going to have an investigation with a final report on the circumstances surrounding the miner's untimely demise. No longer are the lessons learned limited to a miner's immediate coworkers or an apathetic company man. They are available to anyone with access to an internet connection and a desire to not retread the mistakes of the past. On that note, let's follow the chain of events that led to the hospitalization of 7 miners and the deaths of 2 more on the day of November 17th, 2013.
Worms and spiders spinning inside her like the stories make me holy.
The accident day in question was the 17th of November, 2013, but that day was a culmination of events set in motion days before. And the events that follow are paraphrased from the M. Shaw Report with my own commentary and reactions as a miner following. November 11th, 2013. The underground operations manager Jack Clark issued an order suspending work in the Monongahela drift due to lack of ventilation. November 12th. Despite the order forbidding work in the Monongahela, the White Crew's shift boss, Rick Williams, instructed his crew to perform work in there anyway, drilling and blasting 35 holes. The following night shift, Red Crew, at the direction of shift boss Ryan Reese, slushed and hauled the ore from the previous shift and set up to perform more drilling. November 13th. Management puts on an annual refresher training session. White Crew, including shift boss Rick Williams, and in the only tidbit of humor that can be found on this whole affair, Nicholas Capano, job title Nipper/Powder Monkey, are both in attendance. The subject of deteriorated explosives comes up as the mine has a stock of explosives that is starting to go bad. A representative of the mine's explosives distributor, Ross Taberer, is in attendance at the refresher training. He explains the deteriorated explosives should be taken out of the mine and burned, or detonated a little bit at a time with regular production blasts until it's gone. Or the company Taberer works for, Western Explosive Systems Company, or Wesco, could remove them from the property. Dyno Nobel, the company that manufactured the explosives used at the mine, provides documentation in every box of explosives outlining that if the user plans on destroying the product, the manufacturer should be consulted. Dyno Nobel was never consulted. November 14th. White Crew on day shift again worked in the Monongahela drift. This time a miner documented on his 5-point card that ventilation was needed. Red crew the following night shift also again worked in the drift, installing pipe. Management did not take any action about the note the miner made on day shift about the ventilation. November 15th. Work was suspended in the Monongahela drift due to lack of ventilation. Both shift bosses for White and Red crew, Rick Williams and Ryan Reese respectively, wrote on their shifter notes that work was not to be performed until ventilation was established. The same day, White crew shift boss Rick Williams, mine foreman Donald Garul, and technical services manager Martin Chenoweth discussed the handling of deteriorated explosives. They disagreed on the composition of the explosives and whether or not it needed to be destroyed. Chenoweth researched the explosives, found it to be nitroglycerin-based dynamite, and shared this information with mine foreman Donald Garul. November 16th. White crew shift boss Rick Williams, Nipper powder monkey Nicholas Capano, and mucker Michael Perry transferred around 1,600 pounds of deteriorated explosives from the powder magazine to the end of the Monongahela drift for disposal. While there is evidence management had discussions around the handling of the deteriorated explosives, the accident investigation team could not determine if anyone from management actually directed White crew shift boss Rick Williams to destroy the explosives inside the mine. The explosives were transported on flat cars towed by a locomotive. Rick Williams instructed general laborer Christopher Yergardis to accompany him and the others before entering the Monongahela drift to help unload. The group hand-carried the explosives around 150 feet from the locomotive to within 50 feet from the end of the drift. They stacked the explosives against the left rib, interlayered with deck cord. As they worked, the miners complained of bad air. Rick Williams told them to slow down due to low oxygen in the area. Management did not provide or use gas detectors to determine atmospheric conditions. Rick Williams forgot the igniter needed for detonation, and so returned to one of the magazines to retrieve it. He returned at 1400 where miner Magnus Lee and miners helper Corey Geist approached Rick Williams about a problem with their drill. The 6 miners retreated about 1,500 feet from the face of the drift to the Chinaman chute, where most of the work had been performed in the Monongahela drift in the preceding days. At the instruction of Rick Williams, Christopher Yergardis set off the deteriorated explosives. The air blast knocked the miners down along with pelting them with some debris, but there were no injuries. The miners then returned to the revenue lunchroom near the entrance to the Monongahela drift. Nicholas Capano told Magnus Lee he wanted to go back into the drift to see the effects of the blast. Magnus Lee advised against re-entry due to lack of ventilation. At the end of the shift, the day shift crew assembled and traveled to the surface where at 15:30, the day shift crew boarded vans and traveled to the Star Mine Operations main office in Uray, from where they went home for the day. Day and night shift do not overlap at the revenue mine, and there is an approximately half-hour gap between when the day shift goes home and the night shift assembles to go up to the mine. As such, the shift bosses and miners are to leave important messages and notes to each other on a whiteboard at the surface lunchroom at the mine. White crew shift boss Rick Williams, nor any other miner from the day shift, made a note concerning the blast or ventilation in the Monongahela drift for the oncoming night shift. At 1700, Larry Kibble, blue crew shift boss, assembled his crew and gave his crew their work assignments. At 22:30, Larry Kibble receives a call from Underground Operations Manager Jack Clark directing him to send somebody to a water containment area called the Blue Lagoon, located around 900 feet into the Monongahela drift to check on pumps and water levels. Remember, Jack Clark is the same person that issued the order on November 11th not to perform work in the Monongahela drift due to ventilation issues. There is no evidence he ever rescinded the order, or that management took action to correct the conditions leading to him issuing the order in the first place. After Jack Clark's call, Larry Kibble directs his nephew and welder-slash-mechanic Chadrick Kibble and miner 2 Stephen Puderbaugh to the Blue Lagoon. After getting there, they decide to keep walking to a point 1,670 feet into the drift and begin to feel ill. They went back to the Blue Lagoon to finish their work, but were too ill to continue. Chadrick Kibble and Stephen Puderbaugh walk out of the Monongahela to the revenue lunchroom, arriving there at 23:30. They complained of feeling dizzy and disoriented, and Stephen Puderbaugh complained that his hands had no feeling, and Chadrick Kibble told track crew lead man John Gillen, quote, "There is something bad back there." John Gillen traveled around 800 feet into the Monongahela before retreating due to poor air quality. Around that time, Chadrick Kibble and Stephen Puderbaugh's condition deteriorated and were transported to the surface by Trammer and John Gillen's brother, Mitchell Gillen. The miners informed Larry Kibble of what happened to them and their condition. Upon leaving the mine at the end of the shift, John Gillen also reported to Larry Kibble that something was wrong in the Monongahela drift. No gas detectors were used during the shift to determine air quality, but the symptoms were consistent with carbon monoxide poisoning. The night shift ended at 0200 on November 17, 2013. Larry Kibble did not report the miners' illnesses or conditions in the Monongahela drift to upper management, nor did he leave any notes regarding the Blue Lagoon, the miners' illnesses or conditions in the Monongahela drift on the whiteboard for the next shift. At this point, you very well may be seeing how all the holes in the Swiss cheese model are lining up to produce what is likely the worst day, or at least one of the worst days of many people's lives. But before I go over the events of the day itself, I'll try to give some context around some of these events so that those of you who aren't miners have a better idea of what's going on. Starting on November 11th, the underground operations manager issued an order to suspend work to the Monongahela drift due to lack of ventilation. This was a good move. Ventilation in a mine is everything. Proper ventilation keeps dust down, clears out blasting gases, and gets rid of exhaust if diesel equipment is being used. But most crucially, it provides oxygen to the people working in the mine. Oxygen can be depleted in two ways underground. Detonating explosives is the major issue at a working mine, and whenever a blast is initiated, it will displace the oxygen in the area, replacing much of it with gases one would not want to breathe. The second is chemical weathering, which is to say, as rock is exposed to air, certain minerals react with oxygen in the atmosphere, leaching it out. This isn't a problem on the surface because we have wind and plants and is constantly being replaced, but underground with improper ventilation, the oxygen can be depleted to deadly levels. This is just one of the reasons why abandoned mines can be so dangerous. So how do we ventilate a mine? How do we keep everyone breathing? Here we have a very simplified diagram of a mine. We have an intake, which can be a portal or a shaft, and an exhaust, which can also be a portal or a shaft. Mines can either suck or blow, but either way, one is going to need to have a fan to move air along the ramp. And if the designers are conscious of design, mines can even have a natural airflow in the event the mine loses power. But what if we want to drive a drift from this main ramp? Air coming off the main ramp will ventilate it for a bit, but once it becomes too long, we need to add what is called vent bag. Vent bag is essentially just a flexible tube connected to a fan. The fan is placed at the entrance to the dead end drift where it picks up fresh air off the main ramp. It is then guided through the vent bag to ventilate the face. The air is then ventilated back out towards the entrance and carried back down the ramp to the exhaust. Now MSHA says the air has to be sweeping the face, which is to say if you are standing at the face, you must be able to feel the airflow coming off the bag. Generally speaking, at least in my experience, if the end of the bag is any more than 100 feet from the face, it's too far and the face isn't ventilated. For context, the Monongahela drift at the Revenue Mine is 2,300 feet long, and all but the first 400 feet of it was unventilated. This is why the stop order work was put in place. Unfortunately, this was not followed. Moving on to November 12th, both the day and the night shift performed work in the unventilated section of the Monongahela. It's not clear if these folks are aware of the order issued the day prior or not, at least not from what I've been able to dig up from the report. What I do know is that in my experience, if there is an order issued not to work in a particular area, the area is at bare minimum ribboned off with a tag explain the hazard and who issued the order. But typically it goes farther than that. For example, maybe a K-rail is put in front of an open hole to prevent people from driving into it, or an area could be barricaded off entirely, or there may be a sign-in sheet in the manager's office. Generally, the greater the hazard, the more effort there is made to keep people out. The point is, upon entering the drift, there should have at least been some indication the area was off limits, and there is nothing in the report indicating that was the case. Ultimately, a chain and a sign across the drift is not going to stop anyone from entering if they wanted to, but what it would have at least done is make anyone coming across it aware that there's something to take a second thought about, and if they had a concern, to run it up the chain to clarify any misgivings. If there had been a sign, maybe there wouldn't have been any work done. On November 13th, management conducted refresher training and the topic of disposing of deteriorated explosives comes up. First off, the refresher training I am assuming is the refresher training all miners go through once per year. Long story short, if you perform work in an underground mine, you are required to take 40 hours of training before you go underground the first time, and once per year after that, you are required to take an 8-hour refresher, basically a condensed version of what you would go through in 40-hour. Some mines rotate a few people per week through it throughout the year, others do everyone all at once. Anyway, as for the discussion around deteriorated or expired explosives, blowing them up to get rid of them isn't inherently a red flag to me. After all, blowing up explosives is the easiest way to get rid of explosives. That said, they did not contact the manufacturer to find out if it was a safe or correct way to do it, and they disregarded their distributor's advice. Regardless of whether or not blowing their deteriorated product up all at once was the correct course of action, if they had gone about it in a slightly different way, the outcome to the story may have been different. Blowing up a little at a time would have meant fewer gases generated, for example, and had they blown it up in a ventilated drift, the gases would have cleared. But worst of all, the distributor offered to get rid of it for them. Now this is pure speculation, but I think I know why they didn't take the distributor up on his offer. Blowing things up is fun. it might have been that simple. Moving on to November 14th, both day and night crews worked in the Monongahela drift. Not a whole lot to say here other than that they shouldn't have been there in the first place. One thing of note though is that somebody did mark down the lack of ventilation on their 5-point card. This is essentially an area inspection. Every mine has some version of them, and every miner is required to fill them out. The idea behind them is to make miners think about and inspect the area they are working in, documenting and fixing hazards as they go. They then turn them into their supervisors, who are supposed to go over them and escalate hazards up the chain further for anything the miner couldn't rectify themselves. The report indicates that the system was not strictly enforced, and on the day they detonated the deteriorated explosives, White Crew Shift Boss Rick Williams only received a single card, which he, nor anyone else from management, signed. The point being here is that if everyone had turned them in, and if management went over them, there would have been a better awareness not only about the lack of ventilation in the Monongahela drift, but also that the explosives were detonated in there at all. On November 15th, work was suspended in the Monongahela drift. To be clear, they were never supposed to be there in the first place, but for some reason, it was only on the 15th, 4 days after the initial order was issued, that they stopped work and documented it. The report doesn't indicate why this was the case, and I could only speculate as to why. On to November 16th, a lot to go over here. First, they are again working somewhere they shouldn't be. Second, a giant red flag went up when the miners complained about bad air and their supervisor told them to just slow down due to what he acknowledged were low oxygen levels. That's a pretty unacceptable response among many in this incident, but if nothing else it seems pretty indicative of the culture the mine held, especially toward what we refer to in the industry as cowboy shit. Additionally, they didn't put up any kind of sign indicating that there was blasting, either about to occur or had occurred. It is standard practice to put up a sign when you load something, both so that someone doesn't roll in with a heavy piece of equipment before it's gone off, and so someone knows something has or should have gone off when the next person shows up the following shift. Next, they blew up 1,600 pounds of explosives in open air. 1,600 pounds of explosives isn't a particularly large amount of explosives, but it's not insignificant either. For scale, a face round might be a few hundred pounds of explosives depending on size, and I've loaded some rounds pushing close to 20,000, but those explosives are loaded into holes drilled into the rock, not in a pile on the ground. What that means is the energy is directed into breaking rock instead of moving through the air. These guys were a quarter mile away, and they still got knocked on their ass. Even if they had proper ventilation set up, they almost certainly would have blown it up. The lesson is, uncontained explosives are far more damaging for a given amount than contained, especially underground. This particular detail ultimately didn't matter that much in the outcome of this particular incident, but could have led to a similar outcome even if ventilation being installed was the only difference. Next, we probably have the only good detail in the chain of events that day. After going back to the lunchroom, Nicholas Capano mentioned to Magnus Lee that he wanted to go back and look at the results of the explosion. Magnus advised against this due to lack of ventilation. No real notes here, even with stellar ventilation, it takes time to clear. Finally, for day shift anyway, nobody left any notes for the oncoming shift about the blast. It's pretty common practice to talk to your opposite on the next shift, or cross as we call it, to relay what happened during the day, what tasks you completed, how a piece of equipment is running, things like that. In the event you don't or can't talk to them, as was the case here, it's nice to at least leave a note. It doesn't always happen, shit happens sometimes, but someone, especially a shift boss, should have made a mention somewhere to someone about a non-standard event. Again, it's pretty unacceptable on its own not to mention you blew up a drift to your cross, but it's 1,000 times worse because there was no sign put up, or any other indication for that matter, that explosives had been detonated there. The night shift arrived at 1700, where Larry Kibble assembled his crew and provided their work assignments. No real notes, suffice to say we call this meeting a line out, and they are typical. You find out what did or did not get done the shift previous, what kind of work people are going to be doing and where, and what hazards are new, and or what hazards have been fixed. Of course, at this point we know both Larry and his crew are unaware of the blast in the Monongahela drift. At 22:30 though, Underground Operations Manager Jack Clark, the man who issued the order suspending work in the Monongahela, orders Larry Kibble to have someone check on the Blue Lagoon. There are a couple things to go over here. First, I want to reiterate that there is no evidence Jack Clark rescinded the no work order in the Monongahela, so he shouldn't have ordered someone in there in the first place. That said, I could see the self-rationalization in that he was merely having somebody check on the Blue Lagoon. There could be another angle though. I want to be clear, this is just speculation, but in my experience, it's generally not a good sign that someone in the position of upper management is calling at 10:30 at night to check on something, as they usually only work days. It's very possible a line got plugged, or a pump failed, or a sensor broke, causing an alarm to go off somewhere, alerting the chain of command. Not ever having worked here, I don't know for certain, but mines tend to be pretty wet places, and if the wrong pump goes out, very expensive equipment can be flooded in a matter of hours, and it's very hard to get ahead of any flooding once it starts. The fact that Blue Crew shift boss, Larry Kibble, sent a mechanic as one of the people to check on the Blue Lagoon, and that they were unable to complete their task, leads me to believe this is probably what happened. All this to say, this would be a very time-sensitive issue, and I can see why Jack Clark would disregard his own order in this circumstance. It was still the wrong move, but I can see why. Anyway, when Chadrick Kibble and Stephen Puterbaugh got to the Blue Lagoon located in the Monongahela, they decided to walk in even farther. The report doesn't say why they walked in further, and again, I'm speculating here, but it's possible they observed something indicating a blast had occurred. Now remember, the previous shift didn't pass any word on, and they didn't hang up any kind of sign. That said, it's very possible there was debris laying around, or they might have smelled or even seen the smoke, causing them to investigate further. Carbon monoxide itself has no smell, but in my experience explosives leave a very distinct smell, and it's also important to note that the potency of the smell of the smoke does not necessarily scale with the amount of carbon monoxide. I've been in drifts where I was certain I was going to be gassed out based on the smell alone, only for the gas meter to say it was perfectly safe. And conversely, I've been in drifts where I didn't smell a thing, and the gas meter started to go off immediately. Bare minimum, if you smell something, it would be a good idea to grab a gas meter if you aren't sure if somebody cleared it out before you got there. Regardless of why they went back there, they retreated when they started feeling bad, which is a good move, obviously, but then they attempted to complete their work, which was a bad move, and retreated again to the lunchroom, which was a good move. Upon getting to the lunchroom, Chadrick Kibble told track crew lead man John Gillen, quote, "There is something bad back there." At this, John Gillen traveled 800 feet into the Monongahela drift, which was a bad move, as he did not get a gas meter first, but did retreat due to poor air quality. A good move. Trammer and brother of John Gillen, Mitchell Gillen, transported Chadrick Kibble and Stephen Puterbaugh to the surface as their condition worsened. A good move. At the surface, the miners told Blue Crew shift boss Larry Kibble of their experience in the Monongahela, as did John Gillen when he came out at the end of the shift. Again, good moves. At the end of the shift at 0200, Larry Kibble did not inform management of the miners' condition, or the conditions of the Monongahela drift. He also left no notes for the next crew on the whiteboard. There were no efforts made to barricade the drift, and there was no use of gas meters to determine the conditions in the drift. Saying these were bad moves is a complete understatement, because a little more than 12 hours later, 2 miners would be pronounced dead.
This thing, all things devours. This thing, all things devours.
Similar to the last chapter, I'll start with a paraphrasing of the events from the report, followed by commentary and reactions to particular things I think deserve more context. Sunday, November 17th, 2013, 0600, day shift. White crew assembles at the surface lunchroom for line-out, receiving assignments from shift boss Rick Williams. Miners disperse to various parts of the mine. Some of White crew head to the revenue lunchroom. In the lunchroom, a miner with 1 month of mining experience, Nipper Nick Capano, stated he was going to the Monongahela drift to look at the blast area. Corey Geist, a miner's helper with 14 months of experience, accompanied him, as Rick Williams had taught them to never travel alone. Management did not assign either to enter the drift, and no work was assigned to them in there. The two rode a locomotive 1,670 feet into the 2,300-foot-long drift, where they got off and walked toward the end. As they walked, Corey Geist suspected bad air and used a cigarette lighter to check air quality. Upon observing the flame, he told Nick Capano they needed to leave. A few steps toward the locomotive, Nick Capano passed out. He was around 150 feet from the face. Corey Geist managed to stir Nick Capano where they walked another 50 feet. Nick Capano again passed out. Corey Geist also fell ill, falling to a knee. He told Nick Capano he was going to leave and get help. He fell reaching the locomotive, but managed to climb aboard and exit the drift. Miner Kenneth Junkins and mucker Craig Miller observed Corey Geist leave the Monongahela drift and head toward the revenue lunchroom. Upon reaching the lunchroom, Corey Geist said Nick Capano collapsed about 150 feet from the face and needed help. He warned others to be careful because there was, quote, bad air in the drift, and to, quote, turn on some air valves, referring to the compressed air line. 0702. Kenneth Jenkins, Magnus Lee, miner Kyle Schonenbaum, and nipper Leonardo Torres left the lunchroom to find Nicholas Capano. Their locomotive derailed at the Blue Lagoon. Leonardo Torres remained at and tried to get the locomotive back on the track while the others ran toward the face. As the miners proceeded, they stopped to open compressed air valves along the way, but the main airline was turned off near the entrance to the Monongahela. Leonardo Torres felt dizzy trying to re-rail the locomotive and walked out of the drift. 0708. Craig Miller called the surface, informing mechanic Ryan Glover of the accident. Ryan Glover instructed Craig Miller to bring Corey Geist out of the mine. After the call, Corey Geist also called the surface from the lunchroom and spoke to shift surface foreman Mark Coleman, stating, quote, "People are down with cuts and bleeding in bad air and they need help." Miners working in the Yellow Rose Drift overheard the calls for help, and miners Michael McFarland and Arthur Fico, Miner 1 Christopher Scott, and mucker Zachary Fico headed to the Monongahela to help. Around this time, Craig Miller and Corey Geist left the revenue lunchroom and headed to the portal on a locomotive. Meanwhile, back in the Monongahela, Magnus Lee, Kenneth Jenkins, and Kyle Schonenbaum found an unconscious Nick Capano gasping for air. The miners, unable to carry him, dragged him approximately 200 feet before having to retreat, leaving him next to a compressed air line discharge. 0711. Ryan Glover, the mechanic on the surface notified by Craig Miller of the accident, calls Rick Williams. Rick proceeds to call people on the mine emergency contact list and left a voicemail for mine foreman Donald Garul stating the situation. 0715. Mark Coleman tells Rick Williams help was needed underground. Rick states he has been notified and proceeds to call the safety manager, Daniel Woodruff, who instructs him to evacuate the mine and call 911. 0719. Ryan Glover calls 911, reporting one miner was down underground and requested mine rescue support, life flight, and breathing apparatus. He reported they could not get to him because there is no ventilation. Glover then hands the phone to Mark Coleman and goes to the surface lunchroom to monitor the mine pager phone. 0721. Arthur Fico, Zachary Fico, Michael McFarland, and Christopher Scott traveling toward the Monongahela encounter Craig Miller and Corey Geist. They trade locomotives with Arthur taking Geist to the surface while the rest continue to the Monongahela. 0730. Miner Michael Luther entered the Monongahela drift to try and help Nick Capano, passing Kenneth Jenkins, Kyle Schonenbaum, and Magnus Lee as they retreated. Michael attempted to revive Nick by providing breaths. With no response, Michael dragged Nick as he retreated. As Jenkins, Schonenbaum, and Lee exited the drift, Leonardo Torres asked Jenkins how to use his W-65 self-rescuer. Torres donned his W-65 and went in anyway. He found Michael Luther with Nick Capano, who proceeded to help put Nick on Torres' shoulder as they made their way to the revenue tunnel. Torres began to feel nauseated, stopped, and removed his W-65, believing it was not functioning. After 100 feet, Torres could not continue and left Luther with Capano. Luther dragged Capano another 50 feet and collapsed. Luther breathed from a compressed airline to revive himself, but not enough to drag Capano any farther. Luther retreated another 50 feet before passing out. 0735. Rick Williams called Project Director John Trujillo, informing him of the accident. Rick then loaded two 30-minute air packs on a locomotive and traveled into the mine. Around this time, Kenneth Jenkins, Kyle Schonenbaum, and Magnus Lee left the revenue lunchroom on a locomotive to the surface. They met Rick on the way out. Rick returned to the surface with Lee and Jenkins while Schonenbaum returned to the revenue lunchroom with the air packs. After retrieving two more air packs, Rick Williams, along with Ryan Glover and Christopher Yergardis, re-entered the mine and traveled toward the Monongahela. Craig Miller and Michael McFarland entered the Monongahela on foot with a stretcher and an oxygen bottle, while Christopher Scott collected air hoses and Zachary Fico looked for a locomotive. Miller and McFarland found Leonardo Torres disoriented and sitting against the rib, where Miller helped Torres to a compressed air valve and McFarland continued to advance. When Torres fell well enough to leave, Miller left to catch up with McFarland, where they found Michael Luther unresponsive on the track. McFarland attempted to provide oxygen to Luther but didn't have a hose for the regulator. They placed him on the stretcher and started dragging Luther out. Scott met Miller and McFarland dragging Luther and helped carry him to the derailed locomotive. McFarland was unable to continue and retreated while Miller remained with Luther. Scott went back to look for Nick Capano, opening air valves along the way, and discovering the main line was shut, opened it. He proceeded further, connecting an air hose to a valve, and proceeded until he became disoriented and retreated 900 feet to the refuge chamber. Zachary Fico found a locomotive and met McFarland and Torres leaving as he entered the Monongahela. Fico continued to the derailed locomotive, where he and Miller hooked up Luther's stretcher to Fico's locomotive and dragged him back to the revenue lunchroom. Vernon Paulson and Philip Meyer arrived at the revenue lunchroom from the Virginia South, while Rick Williams, Ryan Glover, and Christopher Yergardis arrived from the surface with the air packs. Rick Williams discussed what to do with Schonenbaum, Zachary Fico, and McFarland. McFarland and Schonenbaum were too weak to don their air packs, and so retreated to the surface with Luther, while Rick instructed Zachary Fico, Paulson, and Meyer to remain at the lunchroom, while all other miners were instructed to evacuate the mine. 0800. Rick Williams and Zachary FICO donned their air packs and entered the Monongahela Drift, where they parked at the derailed Loki and advanced on foot. 700 feet past the derailed locomotive, they find Nick Capano. Checking for vital signs, they find none. Zachary puts his face mask on Nick in an attempt to revive him, but with no response, he dons it back on and expresses to Rick Williams they needed to retreat. Rick exclaims he couldn't continue and retreated, while Zachary continued to drag Nick around 400 feet before his air pack's low-level alarm sounded, prompting him to retreat as well. On the way out, Zachary finds Rick against the rib around 50 feet from the derailed locomotive. Zachary motioned to Rick that he was out of air and needed to leave. Rick nodded and pointed out. As Zachary left the drift, he ran out of air and realized Rick was not with him, having returned to Nick Capano. When Zachary FICO arrived at the lunchroom, a member of the San Juan Cooperative Mine Rescue Team, SJCMRT, and Uray County Emergency Medical Service, EMS, Ronald Williams, no relation to Rick or Rory, called in from the surface to request a ride into the mine. Zachary left on a locomotive toward the surface, traveling around 1,000 feet, where he met electrician Daniel FICO, Arthur FICO, and miner's helper Jason Rockwell on a locomotive driven by core driller Michael McCracken, with 4 more air packs and 3 stretchers provided by the Uray County Fire Department. They swapped locomotives at the Terrible Drift, where Zachary continued to the surface. 0815. Daniel FICO and Arthur FICO donned air packs and entered the Monongahela Drift, finding Rick Williams performing CPR and Nick Capano around 300 feet past the derailed locomotive. They tried to put an air pack on Rick, but he resisted, where they then urged him to his feet, walking 50 feet before collapsing. Daniel and Arthur placed Nick on a stretcher and placed Rick on a second, carrying him around 20 feet before Arthur's low air alarm sounded, prompting him to retreat. Daniel dragged Rick another 20 feet. 0830. Ronald Williams of SJCMRT entered the mine on a locomotive with 2 more air packs, blankets, and a gas detector he was delayed in retrieving, being locked in the safety manager's office. Around 500 feet into the Monongahela Drift, the meter read 860 ppm CO, 10% NO2, and 19.5 oxygen, prompting him to don his air pack. Ronald advanced on foot, where he met Arthur FICO at the derailed locomotive, retreating. Ronald informed Arthur of a spare air pack on the locomotive and continued to Daniel FICO, helping him drag Rick Williams another 30 feet, where Daniel's low-level air alarm sounded, prompting him to retreat. Arthur donned the spare air pack and returned to Ronald to assist with Rick. With no spare air packs, Daniel retreated to the refuge chamber on foot. Upon dragging Nick Capano to the derailed locomotive, Ronald checked Nick's vitals, but found no pulse. He then left Nick to help with Rick. As Arthur returned, Ronald's low-level alarm sounded, prompting him to retrieve an air hose attached to the main air line. Arthur dragged Rick to the air hose and went to the locomotive to get blankets. Ronald attached the hose to Rick's wrist with a whip check. Rick was still breathing at the time. Ronald retreated, expressing he felt ill as he passed Arthur on the way out. Arthur returned to Nick and Rick, covering both with blankets. Rick was experiencing difficulty breathing, and Arthur remained with him for around 5 minutes before retreating. Daniel, Arthur, and Ronald all retreated to the refuge chamber, where Vernon Paulson instructed them to evacuate the mine. 1305. The San Juan Cooperative Mine Rescue Team arrived and entered the portal. By 1401, they alerted the command center they were retreating with Rick Williams and Nick Capano. 1413. The SJC MRT arrived at the surface, where the Uray County coroner pronounced both Nick Capano and Rick Williams dead. The cause of death was attributed to acute carbon monoxide poisoning. This incident started because the nipper involved with the disposal of the explosives was tapped into the most primal of male urges, wanting to see the result of what happens when things go boom. And I suspect that urge was even stronger given he had only a month of experience at the time, and something like that would still be quite novel. The report mentions that wasn't part of his or his partner's assigned tasks, but it's not uncommon for miners to check the results of their prior work before the starting of their current work, so the desire and action to check out what he blew up doesn't really throw up any red flags in itself, nor does having someone accompany him to the drift. After all, the buddy system is about as old as mining is. Now, as we learned in Chapter 3, there is no attempt made to barricade the Monongahela Drift after the firing of the explosives, and no attempt made to alert the other crew of the blast. As such, Nick and Corey had no way of knowing whether anyone had been in there or not, and as such, simply assumed it was safe. The more experienced miners out there may realize the fallacy of that, but in the context of this mine and who the miners were that initially re-entered the area, it makes sense why they might think it's safe. Take this section from the report. Quote, Star Mine Operations LLC did not have any written SOP for post-blasting examinations at the mine. Neither management nor miners used multi-gas detectors upon re-entry to the blast area, and they did not conduct a proper post-blast examination of each area. Shift bosses stated during interviews that they would watch for visible smoke in the blast areas. The shift bosses indicated that it normally took about an hour of smoke time before the areas were re-entered. When the miners went back into the blast area, they would carry scaling bars and bar down the loose material as they traveled. There was no method for using blasting sirens, horns, or other audible device to advise miners that the blast area was clear. In addition, multi-gas detectors were not used to determine the levels of oxygen or concentration of airborne contaminants in the work areas. Neither of these miners had much experience. Nicholas Capano had a grand total of 1 month of experience in mining, and Corey Geis had 14. Based on the previous statement from the report, we can gather that for both of these guys' entire mining career, the protocol for re-entering a blasted area was to just kinda wait an arbitrary amount of time. They literally had no other frame of reference. They may have made the assumption that if a standard round takes about an hour to clear, then 12 was probably more than enough even for a bigger round to clear. When Capano stated he wanted to check the blast area, there were other miners around, including miners more experienced, and even one who was present for the firing. But they would have had no way of knowing if the area was cleared or not, and probably didn't know whether or not Nick or Corey had a gas meter, as such may not have had a reason to warn them of any danger when they otherwise may have. Regardless, without a meter they entered the Monongahela Drift, and something made Geist assume bad air. Since they didn't have a meter, he decided to use his lighter. This isn't a good way to test, well, really anything, but he didn't like what he saw and that prompted him to leave. As a test for good air, it's better than nothing, but not by much, because just a few steps later, Nick collapsed. I looked up what percentage of oxygen is required to sustain a flame, and while a lot goes into it, from what I found, roughly 16% is required. For context, the atmosphere is 21%, and our lower limit for our gas meter alarms is 19.5. Either way, oxygen levels were only part of the problem. Carbon monoxide was a much more pressing concern, and a flame will tell you nothing of its concentration. At best, a bad flame will just let you know something other than oxygen is now where the oxygen should be. At the end of the day, it got Corey to leave earlier than he would have, and it's possible that lighter saved his life, and if it were me, I'd have that lighter framed on the wall. As to why Capano succumbed and Geist didn't, at least not to the same extent, I'm not a medical expert, so I'm not going to speculate. Suffice to say, the environment was 100% lethal to anyone that went in there for any length of time, and Corey was probably somewhere between seconds and a few minutes of passing out himself. Thankfully, he didn't, and was able to relay information to some of his coworkers, suggesting that they turn on some air valves. In Chapter 3, I explained briefly how mines are ventilated, and that the Monongahela had none. However, in any heading where miners are working, in addition to the ventilation that should be there are also utilities hung in the back. These consist of a compressed air line, a water line, and usually power and possibly a weep line. So, in an emergency, one could think of the compressed air line as essentially a high-pressure, low-diameter vent bag, and if you've never opened up a 2-inch air line at 120 psi, I can assure you, it moves a lot of air. So when the miners trying to rescue Capano opened up the air lines, it was some good thinking. It was just tragically unfortunate that the main line was closed off. This isn't a bad thing in itself. Trying to pressurize thousands of feet of pipe to 120 psi is a big ask, and any footage you take out of the equation means the compressors don't have to work as hard, and there's less line to develop leaks. So if an area isn't in use, it's not a bad idea to shut off the utilities. The problem comes when they need to be turned on again, and it can take a very long time to figure out where something is shut off or not, and how to turn it back on. For example, at my current job we've sprung leaks in our air and water lines, and it has taken literal days to track down where the lines blew. The report doesn't mention how long it took to repressurize the lines, but this was a situation where seconds were paramount, and at the minimum, it would have taken minutes. It seems they got them pressurized at some point though, because some of the miners used them to breathe, and a hose was even attached to Rick Williams. As far as the air packs the miners used in the rescue attempts, there really wasn't much info about them in the report, other than that they were good for about half an hour. My guess is that they are pretty much just open-circuit scuba systems. Now mine rescue is not my forte, but I'm pretty sure they use closed-circuit rebreathers. Long story short, scuba systems give you minutes, and rebreathers can give you hours. One other thing jumped out at me on the topic of breathing apparatuses, and it's something I found pretty baffling. These are W65 self-rescuers. These particular ones are expired, but this is what they look like, and every single underground miner in the United States is required to have one. To use one, you need to pop this tab, take off the lid, put this strap around your head, the mouthpiece in your face, and this clip goes on your nose. These do one thing, and one thing only. convert carbon monoxide into carbon dioxide. They are supposed to last 1 hour in an atmosphere of 1% carbon monoxide and will last longer or shorter depending on the concentration either direction. And one of the telltale signs that it's working is that it will get hot. The higher the concentration of CO, the hotter it will get. In this whole event, a grand total of 1 person donned their self-rescuer, and he took it out when he thought it wasn't working. Now I want to be clear here, these are called self-rescuers, and their only purpose is to help you, yourself, get to safety. They are not for rescuing other people. And as soon as it goes in your mouth, it should not come out until you are outside, regardless of whether or not you think it's working. That said, any of the miners that went into that drift would have been better off if they had used their W65s and kept them on. This brings me to another very important point though, perhaps the most important lesson of this incident. As soon as it was known somebody went down in that drift and that the atmosphere was dangerous, nobody else should have gone in that drift. They all should have gotten out as soon as possible and let mine rescue do their job. Now, I'll be honest here, I understand why they went in. I too wouldn't want to leave a fellow miner behind if I thought I could help, and I don't know what I would have done myself had I been in the same situation. I also won't lie and say if I had been the one that passed out, that I wouldn't be grateful if someone came and saved me. However, I sure as shit wouldn't want anyone to risk their life to save mine, and that's what happened here. If it's not abundantly clear by now, nobody should have died that day, but an event that could have stopped at 1 fatality turned into 2, and very nearly more, all because people went back in when they shouldn't have. One other thing that jumped out at me was that there wasn't any mention in the report of stench being released to evacuate the mine. At the 2 mines I've worked at, in the event of an emergency, something that smells kind of like natural gas is released into the ventilation system. The idea is that if there are some miners working in an area without radio coverage, they would smell this and know to evacuate, or bare minimum, to get somewhere with communication and get more information. We call this dropping stench, and as far as I know, it's standard practice everywhere. I don't know if it's an absolute requirement of MSHA, but I'll have to get better at navigating their website because I can't find anything at the time of writing this. Either way, the mine was evacuated. Now, the timing between when the first member of the San Juan Cooperative Mine Rescue Team was notified and when the team entered the mine as a collective was about 5 hours and change. Now, like I said, mine rescue is not really in my wheelhouse, so I personally can't say whether or not that's a good response time or not. That said, as far as I can tell, the San Juan Cooperative Mine Rescue Team is regional and not specific to the Revenue Mine, though some of the miners on the team worked there. This means it's going to take time for everyone to get assembled, briefed, and kitted out to go in the mine. That said, the first member of the team, Ronald Williams, arrived at the mine by 0800 and was helping. The report said he was delayed going underground because the gas meter he needed was locked up, and it doesn't say how long exactly he was delayed, but he managed to make it underground by 0830. I won't speculate whether or not this would have made a difference in the outcome of this incident. The team as a whole entered the mine at 1305, having donned what the report called their apparatuses. I again can only assume that means rebreathers, since previously in the report, supplemental breathing devices were referred to as air packs. The report mentions by the time they got to Rick Williams and Nick Capano, neither had a pulse, but Rick was still warm, and they continued to provide CPR to him until they made it back out of the mine at 1413, where EMTs continued until life flight arrived and was pronounced dead at 1442. The portal was locked at 1320. MSHA was notified of the incident at 0752, which was too late. For those that don't know what MSHA is, it stands for the Mine Safety and Health Administration. And long story short, think of it as OSHA, but just for mining. And MSHA has a list of immediately reportable accidents and injuries, informally referred to as the Dirty Dozen. These are events that need to be reported to MSHA within 15 minutes of being known to the mine operator. The first person on the surface with any company authority got the call between 0708 and 0711, though anyone has the authority to call MSHA. The report doesn't say how much impact this latency in calling MSHA had on fines or consequences on the mine, but I'm certain it didn't endear them to the feds. At 0840, MSHA issued what we refer to as a J order, and later modified it to what we call a K order. The nuances between the differences in these are a bit outside my wheelhouse. Suffice to say, when MSHA starts throwing these around, it's anything but good. Basically, it means they'll shut down parts or all of a mine and limit the activities at a mine site that can be performed until they are done with their investigation and the mine comes up with a plan to rectify the problem they're satisfied with. They found that in addition to the 2 fatalities, 20 other miners were exposed to toxic gases, and here's a diagram from the report of where Nick and Rick were found. A couple weeks later, on December 3rd, work started on re-entry of the mine by the company, M. Shaw, and both the San Juan Cooperative Mine Rescue and Front Range Mine Rescue teams. There's not a whole lot to say here, other than the operation took about 6 hours to reach the face, and even 2 weeks after the initial blast, carbon monoxide levels were still at 75 ppm, which isn't an extreme level, but it is double what the low-level alarm is on the gas meters we use at my current job. It's a level where it's just fine to pop in for a few minutes, but you wouldn't want to spend all day in it. They also did an audit of the mine's ventilation. There's not a whole lot to talk about here, suffice to say that they found there was virtually no ventilation in the Monongahela drift past the first 450 feet of the drift, besides the aforementioned compressed air line, that is. They also found the mine just straight up got a lot of their ventilation plans wrong, and didn't do the bare minimum when preparing them to make sure that they were right about what they were assuming. A few notes here on the gas meters. They had 2 Industrial Scientific Corporation MX6 meters and an MSA Altair 5X meter. Here's a crude drawing of kind of what they look like. I'll put links to their websites in the description though. Anyway, the safety manager, Danny Woodruff, stated he kept the meters in his office, which was open while he was on site and locked when he wasn't. He stated the shift bosses had keys in case they needed them. One shift boss said he had access but typically didn't need one, and another said he had no access unless Woodruff was present. It's pretty clear not everyone was on the same page, and unfortunately is right in line with everything we've seen so far. If blasting is happening, somebody needs to have access to a gas meter, full stop. They were able to pull data from the MX6 meters, with the one Ronald Williams used in his initial entry into the mine, the one labeled number 2, hitting a peak of 1500 ppm of carbon monoxide. This is the highest level the detector is capable of, which is to say the actual levels would have been higher. The level of carbon monoxide in the Monongahela drift was literally off the scale. Even hours later, after the mine rescue team retrieved the bodies, the scales were still peaking between 1200 and 1400 ppm. I didn't know off the top of my head what a lethal level of carbon monoxide is, as saying triple digits on a meter is enough to make me immediately fuck off, but a chart I found, and will be linked along with the other sources, indicates 400 ppm is fatal in a few hours, and 1500 ppm is fatal inside half an hour. And again, 1500 ppm is the absolute minimum the miners were exposed to. The report also touched on the miners not using their W65s. The interviews they conducted indicated they didn't use them because there wasn't any visible smoke, which they associated with carbon monoxide. As we went over earlier, the two are independent of each other, and while the confusion for a new miner would be understandable if they didn't get properly trained, any miner who has been around the block a few times should know better. The report goes on to talk about blasting procedures, or more specifically lack thereof. A few takeaways from this section is that a typical production shot was about 200 pounds of explosives, making the disposal shot in this incident 8 times bigger. And 2, management didn't have any method to warn miners before firing a blast, other than a megaphone to warn those in the vicinity of the crushing gallery and mill area. In today's day and age, especially if conducting blasts on shift, that's pretty batshit. I can't attest to how things worked in practice there, but at the current mine I work at, we don't even shoot until everyone is out of the mine, and even then they make announcements and have signs up in front of the loaded rounds. The investigation goes on to say the explosive storage locations were, as you may have guessed, out of compliance. On top of that, they did not keep correct inventory numbers or provide training in any of this. Not a whole lot more to go over here, suffice to say it just illustrates the mine's pattern of half-assery. Unsurprisingly, the underground operations manager, Jack Clark, forfeited his ATF license as he was the responsible party. The ATF conducted their own investigation, finding 9 violations on their own. The report then goes on to talk about training and record keeping. Again, you may have guessed correctly if you thought that it was lackluster. First, any miner nowadays has a lot of paperwork, and it's there for a reason. That said, you get in your groove, you get sidetracked, and maybe you forget to fill out an area inspection or equipment inspection. Shit happens. There's a difference between forgetting one every once in a while and what happened here. At the Revenue, they had a culture where paperwork was rarely filled out and rarely passed on. If a shifter has a group of people reporting to him, and over the course of days and weeks they all put the same things on their inspections, he's going to have an idea of things that need to be addressed, even if only one guy forgets every now and then. However, if that same shifter gets no paperwork from anyone, or only the sparing form here or there, he's not going to have any idea of what's going on and what needs to be addressed. As tedious as it is, that's why we have paperwork. It also seemed common to have people doing tasks they were not qualified or trained for. If this isn't immediately obvious why this is a problem, especially in a profession like mining, I'm not sure what to tell you. Before I give my final thoughts, I'll just read the conclusion of the report in its entirety. Quote, "The accident occurred due to management's failure to dispose of deteriorated explosives in a safe manner in direct conflict with instructions that it received from the explosives distributor. The explosives were detonated in the Monongahela drift that was not ventilated, and in which, according to mine records, miners were not to be working. Management failed to conduct a post-blast examination and did not provide any notice to the oncoming shift regarding the blasting activities in the Monongahela drift. The Monongahela drift was not barricaded, and on the next shift after the blast, 2 miners went into the unventilated area and reported feeling very ill. However, management still failed to take any action. Additionally, management did not establish an accurate and effective ventilation plan, barricade or seal unventilated areas, indoctrinate new employees in safe work procedures, or properly train miners. Finally, management failed to withdraw persons as a result of the imminent danger created by detonating the deteriorated explosives in an unventilated area of the mine. The Mine Safety and Health Administration, MSHA, was not notified of the immediately reportable accident that occurred on November 16, 2013. The mine was ultimately fined $1.077 million, the second highest fine given out to a non-coal mine, and issued nearly 100 citations. Since then, the mine has changed hands a few times and has gone in and out of periods of work. Ultimately, nobody went to jail, at least as far as I know. This was a frustrating report to go through. This was a textbook example of complacency killing, as it inevitably always will. I don't blame Nicholas Capano in this incident. The guy had been underground for a grand total of a month, surrounded by bad habits and worse training. Being his only mining frame of reference, it's unfortunately likely he didn't even know the danger he was in just by showing up to work every day. Mining is hazardous work, always has been, and always will be, but there's a difference between being surrounded by hazards and danger. A safe mine will, should, and has the moral obligation to mitigate hazards to its best ability. But this was an example of a dangerous mine where the most basic hazard mitigation measures were ignored or not even implemented on every level. I hope that makes sense. Nicholas Capano left behind a wife and 2 young kids at the age of 33. I have much more conflicted thoughts on Rick Williams. The simple fact is he was part of the problem, and a big one at that. If he had done his job, both he and Nick would be alive now. Full stop. At the same time, in the span of a couple hours, he fulfilled what, in a movie, would be a textbook redemption arc. This, however, was not a movie. It actually happened, and the only people, in my opinion anyway, that can judge whether or not he redeemed himself were the people he affected with his actions. Not just Nick and his family, but the people that then risked their lives to pull him out. Rick Williams was 59 and left behind a wife, 2 kids, and a grandchild. As for the miners that tried to rescue them, I don't just mean the official rescue team, I mean the guys that charged in as soon as they heard the news. On a strictly analytical level, I can't condone them going in risking their lives instead of simply evacuating and waiting for the rescue team. As a miner, however, those guys are a bunch of goddamn badasses, and are the exact kind of people I'd want around me in an emergency. If that's not the dictionary definition of metal, I don't know what is. I'll be less charitable to the management. If their actions didn't speak enough, I'll let Rory Williams, the former co-owner and director of operations, speak for himself after being contacted by the Telluride News in regards to the release of the report. Quote, "All we know is what they posted on their website," he said. "Star Mine Operations has no more assets. We lost a ton of money on this project and they killed us. Running a good old-fashioned family business is not possible in the mining industry anymore." The simple fact is, if you can't run a good old-fashioned family business in the mining industry without running it safely, then you have no business running a mine. In an article for the Denver Post, Joseph Maine, the then Assistant Secretary of Labor for Mine Safety and Health, was blunt. Quote, "There are a number of mines all across the United States that have implemented sound safety habits. This is the mine that did not," said Joseph Maine, Assistant Secretary of Labor of Mine for Safety and Health. "They had a number of opportunities to take action, but they failed to follow basic safety procedures, We believe these deaths were entirely preventable. That's about all I have for you on this. I encourage you to check out the materials I used to make this video, especially the final report, as there is a lot I left out for the sake of brevity. If you have thoughts on this, I'd love to hear them, and doubly so if you have any proximity to this incident. If there's enough questions that people have, and I didn't answer, perhaps I'll make an appendix video. In the meantime, please stay safe. A couple post-edit notes here. Obviously I use quite a lot of AI images, and I probably used a script's worth of prompts to generate them, with very mediocre results. This isn't a solution I love, but it's the one I've got, at least until I become a better artist, I guess. I'm sure you don't like it, nobody likes it, I don't like it, so I apologize. Next, I may have been pronouncing Monongahela wrong. In the report, it is spelled Monongahela, but on some of the maps, it's labeled Monongahela. I do not know which is correct. And finally, if you have any format changes you'd like to see in future videos, let me know. I am completely open. If you made it this far, thank you very much for watching. This is by far the largest project I've undertaken in video production so far. I really appreciate it. I'll see you next time. Bye.